He went to Dust Devil Pass instead, rode away with an Apache bride who chose him as her partner. He came to the town to collect a debt, but instead found himself paying one he never knew he owed. The sun had only just cleared the jagged peaks of the Dragoon Mountains when I rode into the choked main street of Dust Devil Pass, its harsh, yellow light already spreading across the makeshift auction square, where the silver mine owner, a bloated man named Holt, had decided to make his weekly display of power. It was late spring, 1885, and the Arizona Territory had been hard on men like me. The heat was a living thing, a searing blanket that pressed down on the scalp, and the wind was a constant, grinding whisper that carried the taste of red dust and cheap whiskey. My target, a bank robber with a lazy eye and a 500 bounty on his head, was nowhere to be seen. I had set out this morning with a single purpose in mind: find the man, turn him over to the marshal in Tucson, and secure the cash I needed to keep my belly fed and my horse shod through the summer. My name is Silas Vance, 42 years old, tall, my frame lean and hard from 2 decades of riding, fighting, and going without. My face, what little of it showed beneath the brim of my wide crown hat, was cut with the scars of the war, not a bullet hole, but the subtle, weary lines of a man who'd seen the worst of what men do to each other and had chosen silence as his shield. They called me Stone Eye in the territories, and it wasn't for my good looks. The coat I wore was a Union cavalry duster, patched and worn, but it kept the dust off and the secrets in. I carried a Winchester Model 1873 snug in its scabbard, and a Colt single action on my hip tools of a trade that bought a man an empty life but a clean conscience, if he was careful. I lived alone. That's just a fact of my life now, one I signed the papers for when I buried the last piece of my old self in the mud outside Fredericksburg. The silence of the open country was what I preferred, broken only by the sound of my horse's breath, the creak of saddle leather, and the rare, necessary word I spoke to a town clerk or a bartender. I hadn't thought of anything resembling a future. Not seriously. Not after seeing everything I cared about turn to ash. Dust Devil Pass was worse than most mining towns. The air stank of sulfur, stale sweat, and the rank exhaust of human desperation. Wagons stood crooked, wheels buried deep in the churned red dirt. Men's voices rose over the din shouts of miners, the clatter of hammers, and the ugly sound of a crowd gathering for amusement. I tied my horse to a hitching post, adjusting the loop of my duster at the waist, and walked slowly toward the noise. I moved with a practiced, steady gait, shoulders squared, eyes scanning, but never lingering. My money was in a leather pouch inside my coat, just enough for the trip and the bare essentials, not enough to get tangled in the mess I saw ahead. But then I heard the noise shift. It was the kind of laughter that scrapes a man's nerves, sharp, mean-spirited, not the sound of men enjoying a drink, but of men enjoying a victim. I turned toward it. At the edge of the square, a flatbed wagon had been pulled up. Against the rough-hewn rails, 3 figures were chained, 2 men, heads bowed, and a woman. Men stood in a loose, drunken semicircle, jeering and shouting crude remarks, their faces flushed with morning whiskey and malice. The sight tightened a knot in my stomach. The old soldier in me, the part that remembered the smell of burnt flesh and the cries of the helpless, recognized this cruelty immediately. One of the figures drew my eyes and held them. She stood younger than the rest, maybe 25, the way the light hit her high cheekbones and the fierce set of her jaw. Her hair was long and black, thick as a raven's wing, though tangled and caked with dust. Her skin was the color of copper, the bronze of the Navajo people, but beneath the dirt and bruises, there was a quiet strength in her stillness. She wore a thin, torn cotton dress, an insult of clothing, not protection that had been ripped at the shoulder and the hem. The way she stood, jaw clenched, shoulders stiffened against the onslaught of crude humor, spoke volumes. She kept her gaze fixed on the ground, but I saw the fire in the way her body refused to shrink, even as she was forced into a posture of shame. They pointed. They made jokes. They laughed louder each time she drew her arms across her chest in a futile attempt to cover herself. Her name, though I would not know it until much later, was Teyuna. But here, In the cold, hard world of the white man, they had reduced her to a nickname, Kestrel. She had been a wife, the partner of a sheep herder who had tried to defend his family's land claim against Holt's men. He had failed. She had been dragged from her home, her few possessions stolen, and now she was being sold to cover a debt that was nothing but a lie on paper. Each day had stripped something from her, but her silence was a barricade. Her eyes, when they occasionally flicked up, were alive with calculation, watching for the smallest chance to survive. She was the picture of a lone, vulnerable woman facing an unjust, objectifying situation. The auctioneer, a weasel-faced man with a voice too loud for his frame, shouted a mock price, calling her a burden too proud for a decent home. The men roared with laughter. One man, a foreman for the mine, I recognized him, slapped a friend on the back. Another spat on the ground near the wagon wheels. I felt my jaw tighten, the old ache in my chest returning, the one I'd carried since the war. I told myself I had no business here, no reason to get involved. I was hunting a criminal, and I had exactly enough money for that job and no more. I had a reputation, lone drifter, stone-eyed killer. I could turn and walk back to my horse, ride out, and finish my day as planned. But I didn't move. I felt the familiar weight pressing down, the heaviness that settled whenever I saw a strong man abuse a weaker one. It was the same cold, unyielding knowledge that had made me choose the Union cavalry back in '61, a choice for justice, even if it cost me everything. I looked at the young woman again, saw her, trembling beneath the thin dress, her head bowed as if each laugh struck her like a bullet, and something in me, some core of decency that had survived the hell of war, refused to turn away. The air vibrated with the tension of her suppressed fury. The auctioneer barked again, impatient, leaning in to whisper a crude joke to the foreman. That was when I reached inside my coat. I didn't pull the 500 bounty I was chasing because I hadn't earned it yet. I pulled the 200 I had left for food and supplies, the last of my savings. The men shouted louder. "Fool!" one called out. "Can't you tell the difference between a wife and a mule?" I ignored them. The world was full of men who spoke too loud with empty hearts. I stepped forward, my boots grinding the red dust, and pressed the folded bills, all of it, into the auctioneer's sweaty hand. He smirked, counting the money with greedy, hurried fingers, then shrugged and cut the rope that bound her to the wagon rail. The snap of the cord was startlingly loud. She flinched at the sound, her eyes flicking upward for the first time. They met mine, dark, deep as a desert night, against my pale gray, steady but filled with utter disbelief. There was no gratitude, no appeal, only a desperate question in their depths. She did not move until I stepped aside and dropped the cut rope into the dirt, an unnecessary but symbolic gesture. Slowly, stiffly, she slid down from the wagon, landing on her bare feet, her arms tightening again around the torn fabric at her chest. Her body was shivering despite the heat. The crowd began to jeer, calling out that I was a fool who'd bought trouble. I didn't answer. I untied my horse, mounted, and reached down a hand, the gesture a silent command. She hesitated, then placed her fingers in mine. Her touch was cold, the bones of her hand sharp against my palm, but her grip was surprisingly firm. I pulled her up behind me. She sat stiffly, gripping the saddle horn, her body tense and light against my back. The horse moved forward, hooves thudding against the packed earth as the noise of the fair faded behind us. The smell of dust and malice thinned, replaced by the cold, clean wind sweeping down from the Dragoon Peaks. I said nothing. My thoughts were heavy, circling. I knew I had traded my means of survival for an uncertain path. I had a woman at my back whom I did not know, had not planned for, and who was no doubt dangerous in her fear. But I also knew I could not have left her there, standing under the laughter of men who would never see her as human. It was a choice of honor, nothing more. The dusty roads of the Arizona Territory in the late 1800s. It was a time when a man's word was often the only law, and a woman's worth was calculated on a ledger book by men who had forgotten how to look up at the sky. If only I could tell you that the sight of her, a beautiful captive, had swept away the years of loneliness. But grief doesn't work that way. It's a cancer that sits in the chest, quiet and cold, and even a moment of heroic action cannot thaw it. I had bought her freedom, not my own peace. The silence between us, as the horse carried us away from the wretched sound of that town, was heavier than any church bell on a Sunday. It was the sound of a mistake, the echo of a forgotten vow, and the stark, uncompromising fact that I was now responsible for a life when I could barely manage my own. The trail home stretched long and empty, the late autumn wind cutting sharp against our faces as the horse moved steady across open ground, its breath steaming in the cold air while the woman sat stiff behind him, her hands gripping the saddle horn tight, her body tense each time the horse jolted over a rut in the earth, her bare feet pressing against the leather skirts as if to brace herself. The sun was rising higher, but for us it was the darkest hour, the hour of the unknown, the hour of pure, desperate uncertainty. If you enjoy the story, hit that subscribe button right away, and if you don't, then just hit the like button anyway to keep more Wild West love stories coming. The Canyon Trail and the Trial of Trust. The ride back to my small abandoned way station was 2 hours of sheer, grinding silence. The horse's hooves struck the frozen dirt, a metronome counting down the seconds until I had to face the consequences of my impulse. I was $200 lighter and carrying a burden heavier than any bounty I'd ever chased. The distance was from Dust Devil Pass to the Dragoon foothills, where the land lifted toward the craggy shelter of the peaks. As we traveled, I felt the slight tension of the woman's body against my back, a constant reminder that she was still a prisoner, regardless of who paid the ransom. I kept my own body still, not letting myself shift or turn, because I knew that every movement mattered now, and any sign of demand or claim could break the thin thread of her fragile cooperation. We didn't talk. I didn't know her language, and she clearly had no desire to speak mine. But I could read the silence. It was not the silence of a grateful rescue, but the thick, wary quiet of a cornered animal. It was not filled with the threat of the drunken men, but it was not empty of fear either. She kept her eyes on the horizon, watching how the jagged, rust-colored hills drew closer. I thought of what she might be thinking. Silas Vance, an ugly man with ugly money, and a sudden, unwelcome interest. I swallowed the explanations and the assurances that came to the edge of my tongue. I had never been a man of many words. Actions were cleaner, more honest. They would have to show her sooner than promises ever could. When we reached the small rise that opened to my land, a sheltered, narrow valley tucked against a sheer canyon wall, the site was plain and rough. The way station was little more than a stone and adobe shell, a relic from a stagecoach line, long abandoned. The roof was patched with tin, the yard scattered with bleached bone and rock, and smoke trailed faintly from the chimney of the main room. To a stranger, it was nothing. To me, it was survival. To her, it was just another cage. I swung down first, my boots hitting the rocky ground, then held out my hand. She hesitated a long, agonizing breath, but slid down slowly, landing barefoot. Her arms tightened again around the torn neckline of her dress as the cold air bit into her skin. I took the reins, led the horse to the lean-to shed, and she followed a few steps behind, her eyes darting everywhere, scanning the shadows as if expecting a trap. I unbuckled the saddle, lifted it off with steady hands, and then poured a measure of oats into a trough. The woman stood by the doorway, her arms folded tight, her breath coming sharp in the chill, her body shivering, though she tried to hide it. I noticed. Inside the station, it was warmer but still thin against the mountain cold. The room was small, a small cot against the wall with a wool blanket folded rough, a table built from old crate wood, 2 mismatched chairs, and a small iron stove near the corner. No second bed, no room for more than one, and I saw her eyes register that fact immediately. Her body tensed again as she stepped just inside the threshold. I set down my rifle by the door where it always stood, then hung my coat on the peg. My movements were deliberate, slow, showing her each thing so there would be no sudden gestures. I lit a lantern, the flame throwing yellow against the stone walls, then set a pot on the stove and poured water and dried beans into it, dropping in a strip of salt pork. She stood silent, watching each motion. Her stomach growled with hunger. I heard it, but she did not step forward. did not ask. I glanced once at her, saw the tremor in her hands, and returned my eyes to the pot. The smell of cooking filled the room after a while. When I pushed a bowl across the table, she moved slow, sat on the edge of the chair, and ate in small bites, pausing each time as if waiting for me to take the bowl away or strike her for eating too quickly. I did neither. I ate my own portion, silent. I noticed how she tried to shield her chest with her arm while leaning forward. The torn dress was a source of constant, visible shame. I turned my eyes to the stove instead. She noticed that too, the way I looked away. Something small, almost hidden, shifted in her. Her breath came steadier afterward. When the food was gone, I rinsed the bowls in a pan of water. She rose, took the cloth from me without a word, and dried them herself, her eyes down, but her movements steady. It was the first act of her own will in my space, and I let her keep it. When she set the bowls on the shelf, she stood for a long moment, not knowing what would come next. I crossed to the chest where my old gear was kept. I pulled out a spare wool blanket and my own thick, Army-issue duster. The one I wore was a lighter civilian model, and laid them on the ground near the far wall. Then I sat down to pull off my boots. I did not explain. I simply stretched out on the floor, one arm behind my head, facing the door. Her eyes stayed on me for a long time before she crossed to the cot and lay down, clutching the wool blanket to her chin. Sleep didn't come quickly for either of us. I lay awake, thinking of the 200 I had spent, of the bounty I still had to chase, and of the bare feet I saw when she stood near the fire. I thought of the way her hands trembled around the bowl, and though the road ahead was uncertain, I did not regret what I had done. The cost was worth the silence of my own conscience. Morning came gray and bitter. I rose first, moving slow so as not to startle her. She stirred when the floorboards creaked, opening her eyes to the dim light. Her body stiffened, but when she saw me moving quietly near the stove, stoking the coals, rather than reaching for her, she let her fingers loosen. I brewed coffee and set bread on the table. She took it, chewing slow, her eyes never leaving me. I noticed her feet again, red from the cold stone floor. From the chest, I pulled out a pair of old wool socks, worn but warm, and set them on the edge of the cot without speaking. She looked at them, then at me, as if expecting a trick. I only turned back to my coffee. After a moment, she slipped them onto her feet, her eyes dropping as though ashamed to accept a kindness. I said nothing. A small easing in my chest was my only reward. When I opened the door, the wind rushed in, sharp and stinging. I pulled on my coat and motioned for her to follow. She stepped outside hesitantly, shivering. I led her toward the woodpile. Picking up the axe, I split one log clean, then handed the heavy tool to her. She stared at it, then gripped the handle. Her first swing struck crooked, the blade glancing off. Her jaw set, and she tried again. This time the axe bit deeper. She kept swinging until the wood split with a clean, satisfying crack. A tiny curve touched her lips, the closest thing to a smile I had seen. I nodded once, approving, and gathered the split pieces. We carried the wood inside together. For the first time, she seemed less like a captive and more like a necessary part of the rhythm of the place. I had lived too many years alone. The sight of another pair of hands, working, pulling their weight, stirred something I hadn't felt since the funeral. Honor in work. That's what a man respects. Later, I brought her to the small, enclosed paddock where my 2 horses stamped. I showed her how to scoop oats into the trough, how to brush their coats clean of frost, how to check hooves for stones. She followed each motion carefully, her eyes sharp and watchful. When one of the horses nudged her shoulder, she flinched, but did not back away. Soon, her hand settled against its neck, stroking slow. Language hung between us like a wall. My words were English, heavy and spare. Hers, when they came at all, were the soft, patterned clicks of her tongue. But in work, the barrier shrank. A gesture, a shared glance toward a bucket or a rope was enough. She learned quickly, and I learned when to step back and let her prove herself. By midday, we returned with water from the creek, our arms sore. She surprised me by taking the spoon from my hand, stirring the beans, then finding dried sage on the shelf, sage I'd forgotten was there, and dropping a pinch into the pot. The sharp, clean smell filled the cabin. For a brief second, I felt a pang of memory, the ghost of a woman's touch on a kitchen shelf. I forced the thought away. They say the desert cleanses a man, but the mind holds on to what it loses. We ate in silence. She sat straighter now, less guarded. The torn neckline of her dress still bothered her. I could see it. I fixed my gaze on my bowl. The fact that I kept my eyes off her, that I honored her shame with my own restraint, settled on her mind longer than the meal itself. One evening, before stepping out to chop wood, I went to the chest where I kept the few things my wife had left, a worn, blue calico shirt, folded away since the day she was buried. My hand hovered, heavy with memory. I lifted the shirt and a leather belt, setting them on the cot without looking at her, and stepped out into the cold. When I returned, she was standing by the fire wearing the shirt. The belt cinched at her waist, the torn dress folded neatly on the cot. The fabric covered her fully, her body now her own again, not a public display. Her throat moved as she swallowed hard, her hands brushing at the sleeves, testing if they were truly hers to keep. That evening, she cooked for the first time. The meal was richer than anything I'd made in months. I looked at her, and though words sat thick on my tongue, words of thanks, of respect, none came. I gave a small, slow nod, and set my spoon down. She saw it. Her lips curved faintly, a smile so brief it might have been the firelight, but it was real. Later, she was sitting near the stove, her hands folded in her lap when she spoke softly, her voice carrying both hesitation and weight. Mine, too. The words were halting, but clear. I turned my head toward her, my gray eyes steady. Yours too, I repeated, giving back the phrase in the same way. She pointed toward the beans on the table, then toward her own chest, and said again, mine too. Oh, I understood. She was telling me that what I ate, she ate. That this place was not only mine, but now hers as well. For a long moment, the silence stretched, and I felt something stir inside me, something I had not felt since, before loss had hollowed me out. I stood, lifted my washed cavalry coat from its peg, and laid it across her shoulders. She stiffened, then pulled it closer, her fingers gripping the worn fabric as though it were proof of something unspoken. She whispered a word I did not know, a soft Apache syllable. I could not understand the words, but I understood the meaning. That night, when I lay on the hardboards, I saw her sitting on the edge of the cot, my coat still wrapped around her. Her dark hair fell loose along her cheeks. For the first time, her eyes did not dart away when they met mine. They were steady and strong. It was the first true crack in the wall between us. The healing began not with a kiss, but with a word. If you like Wild West love stories or Wild West stories, drop a bunch of 1 second and your place in the comments for the Wild West Love channel. Tell me where you're listening from so I don't feel so alone out here. The hunt and the core choice. The snow softened by the 5th day, the wind breaking just enough that the ground turned to slush near the way station. I knew the thaw meant movement traders, riders, and the inevitable curiosity seekers who would remember the spectacle at Dust Devil Pass. I had to finish the work that brought me here. The 500 bounty on the bank robber was no longer just about food. It was about securing a claim, a legal means to defend the life I had unexpectedly acquired. I had to ride out. It was near dawn when I saddled my horse. Kestrel, that's what I called her now, the name she had been given by the white men, but which suited her fierce, watchful stillness, stood by the door. She didn't cling. She didn't beg. She only handed me my canteen and my spare round. Day, I said, pointing to the sun and then holding up 2 fingers. I repeated the words slowly, firmly. Silas, back. Her dark eyes held mine. Hiawatha, she whispered, pointing to the rifle. It was her word for rifle, the first full, non-essential word she'd offered in her own tongue. A test, an offering. I nodded. Yes, Hiawatha, for you. I pulled the Winchester from the scabbard and placed it in her hands. It was heavy, but her grip was sure. I showed her the firing mechanism again, running through the steps with slow, deliberate gestures. I didn't need to tell her how to defend herself. I needed to give her the means. Before mounting, I reached into my coat and pulled a slip of paper. It was a crude map of the area, showing the location of a shallow spring and a narrow canyon passage, places she could run to if trouble came. "Run," I said, pointing to the trail, then to the map. Her lips were tight. She gave one sharp nod, then stepped back into the doorway, the rifle resting against the adobe wall, its barrel glinting. I didn't look back. I rode east, tracking the bank robber into the foothills, my conscience clear in the knowledge that I had left her armed and ready. My hunt was cold and methodical. I found the robber's trail near an old logging camp, a man careless with his habits and heavy with his money. The pursuit took me 3 days, not 2, and it was a grinding, agonizing push through dry gullies and rock slides. I found him sleeping, pistol in his hand, and the encounter was brief and quiet, no challenge, no hesitation, just justice, delivered cold and clean. I tied the man over his own saddle and began the long ride back, the 500 bounty no longer a goal, but a tool. I reached the way station late on the 3rd evening. The sun had gone, and the valley was dark. I saw the smoke, first too much of it, black and heavy, rising from the direction of my camp. My chest went cold. I spurred my horse into a gallop, the sound of hooves muffled by the dirt. When I burst into the yard, the air was still thick with the smell of burnt wood and cordite. The door of the way station was splintered. The woodpile was scattered. My iron stove was overturned outside, and the single glass window I had installed was shattered. I slid off my horse, rifle already in hand, my body tense, ready for a fight. "Kestrel," I called out. Silence. Only the sound of the prisoner's ragged breathing on his horse. I moved to the doorway, my eyes adjusting to the darkness inside. I heard a faint sound, a low, rhythmic wheeze. I stepped over the splintered wood, and I saw her. She was sitting in the corner, her back pressed against the cold stone, the Winchester resting across her lap. There was blood on the stock, and her right shoulder was wrapped crudely in a piece of my old shirt. Her breath was coming in short, painful gasps, and her eyes, when they lifted to mine, were wide with pain, but not fear. I dropped to my knees beside her. "What happened?" The words were rough, torn from my throat. She lifted a trembling hand and pointed to the yard. "Holt's men," she whispered, her English halting. "3. She held up 3 fingers. "Want, Kestrel." I looked at the damage, the shattered window, the torn fabrics. "You fought?" She nodded. A slight, pained movement. 2 ran. 1 stayed. She pointed to a dark smear on the opposite wall. "Gun, Hiawatha." I knew then. The silence of the 3 days had been a trial, and she had passed it. She had used the tools I gave her and her own fierce will. She had defended the space, and in doing so, had claimed it. I checked her shoulder. A glancing blow, not a bullet, but a bad burn from a rifle barrel or a harsh strike. I took my canteen and began to clean the wound. She flinched, but did not pull away. "Silas," she said, her voice a low murmur. She spoke my name, and in that moment, it felt like an anchor. "They won't come back," I said, my voice dangerously low. "I will deal with Holt's men." My initial plan to deliver the bank robber to Tucson vanished. Holt the mine baron was the greater threat to the only thing in this territory that mattered to me now. He had violated my home. He had hurt the woman I had sworn, by my own silent code, to protect. This wasn't about the law anymore. It was about honor and personal justice. I spent the next hour tending to her. I removed the dirty cloth, cleaned the wound with whiskey, and wrapped it tight. She watched every movement, her dark eyes steady. She knew what was coming. She knew the kind of man I was, the kind who only spoke when action was required. That night, after I secured the prisoner in the shed and began to repair the way station, she spoke again. "Husband. Dead," she said softly, touching her chest. "Mine, too." I paused, hammer in hand. I looked at her, sitting on the cot, my coat wrapped around her good shoulder. The silence of my own past rushed back the smell of the raw dirt over my wife's grave. "Wife died here," I said, my voice rough. The first time I had spoken of it in years. Child, too. Been alone since. We sat across from each other in the dim lantern light. Our grief laid bare, different people, different lands, different losses, but the same hole in the soul. I gave a single nod, my only answer. She picked up a piece of broken glass, a shard from the window. Not alone, she whispered, her eyes holding mine. I moved from the stove to the cot, sitting beside her, closer than I had ever dared. I took the glass from her hand and gently placed my hand over her unwounded shoulder. She leaned her head lightly against my chest. It was not a move of passion, but of mutual recognition of pain. The physical boundary was broken by a shared wound. The silence was filled with an unspoken vow of loyalty and a fierce determination to protect this new, fragile connection. She had tested me by staying, by fighting. I had passed the test by returning, and by choosing her safety over my bounty. That was the core choice of a man of honor. Hey there, friend, take a moment and get yourself a full glass of water. It's easy to forget, but staying hydrated is crucial for your health. Also, if you've been sitting for a while, do a quick lap around the room and give your eyes a break from the screen. Your body will thank you. The gift of name and the vow of honor. The bank robber was turned over to the authorities in Tombstone, not Tucson. I took the longer ride because Tombstone had a telegraph office and a lawyer who owed me a favor from a long-forgotten poker game. The 500 bounty was mine. It was enough to get us through 2 hard winters, or, as I decided, to buy something that money couldn't touch: legality and peace of mind. I didn't return to the way station for 5 days. I needed to finish the hunt. I'd started the hunt for a legal right to stand my ground. When I rode back through the Dust Devil Pass, I avoided the main street and rode straight to the land claim office. I didn't spend the money on ourselves. I spent it on a piece of paper, a patent deed for the land surrounding the way station, officially naming Silas Vance as the sole owner. I bought us the right to belong. When I finally rode into the valley, Kestrel was waiting. She didn't run out to meet me, but stood in the doorway, the sun setting behind her, painting the sky with the violent oranges and reds of the Arizona desert. The Winchester was on the table beside her. The way station was clean. She had used my thread and needle to patch the splintered door and had swept the last of the glass from the floor. The scent of pine and sage filled the air, her herbs, her way of making the space whole again. I dismounted, my body aching from the long ride, and walked toward her. I pulled the rolled deed from my saddlebag and placed it on the table. "This," I said, pointing to the paper, then to the ground. "Ours." She looked at the paper, then at me, her brow furrowed. She didn't understand the word deed or patent, but she understood ownership and control. She understood that I had spent the money I had risked my life for on a piece of ground for us. "No running?" she asked, her English slow but clear. I shook my head. "No running, not unless we choose." I sat at the table, taking off my hat. I was tired, but the work was not yet done. The biggest threat was still out there. "Holt," I said, the name a stone in my mouth. "He will come." As if summoned by the very word, the sound of hooves echoed in the canyon entrance. 2 horses, 2 men, not Holt himself, but his foreman, the same man who had been the loudest at the auction, and another thug. I pushed Kestrel behind the table. "Stay, Hiawatha." I walked outside, my hand resting near the butt of my Colt. I stood in the middle of the yard, my shadow long in the twilight. The foreman pulled up, a sneer on his face. "Well, look what the buzzard dragged in. Thought you'd run for the hills, Vance. Heard you killed one of Holt's boys. You got a nerve coming back here." "Zero. He was trespassing," I said, my voice low. "This is my land now." I pointed to the way station. "Land?" The foreman scoffed. "Holt owns everything that matters in this county, Vance, and he sent us to get what you stole. The Navajo. And that 500 from the bounty. Hand it over, and maybe he'll let you ride out with your skin on." I looked at him. I had the deed. I had the gun. I had the silent, fierce woman at my back. I would not trade my honor for his temporary peace. "The girl is not for sale. The money is spent on this dirt. Now, ride out, and tell Holt to stay off my claim." The foreman drew his pistol, a foolish, reflexive action. I didn't hesitate. The Colt cleared leather and barked once. A quick, clean shot not to kill, but to maim and humiliate. The bullet struck the dirt an inch from his boot heel, kicking up a spray of dust and rock that sent him yelping back in the saddle. His partner, realizing I wasn't the kind of man to wait for fair play, quickly turned his horse and fled. The foreman sat trembling, his gun on the ground, his face pale. "Tell Holt," I repeated, my voice ice-cold, "that if he or his filth steps foot on this land again, I will hunt him down like the dog he is." He picked up his gun, muttered a curse, and rode off. I walked back into the way station. Kestrel stood where I left her, her eyes blazing, the rifle in her hands. She had watched the whole exchange. She saw that I did not need to kill to win, and that my word was law on my own ground. I placed the deed in her hands. "Marry me, Tayuna." I used her true name, the first time I had spoken it aloud. "Not as a wife you were bought, but as the partner I choose. The partner who defends this land with me. We are bound by honor, not money. Do you choose it?" Her throat moved. She looked at the deed, then at the Winchester, then at my face. She saw the man of honor who had sacrificed his means of survival for her freedom, who had fought her battles, and who was now asking for her choice. She set the deed down, reached out, and touched the scar on my jaw, the old cavalry wound. "Yes," she whispered. "Partner, I choose." She had found a man whose code of honor, integrity, and self-sacrifice met her deepest need for respect and protection. I had found a reason to live again, a woman who saw the man beneath the scars. If you're watching on TV, don't hesitate, grab your phone and hit subscribe to my channel so you'll never miss out on our amazing characters. Sunset over the Dragoon Mountains. The unwritten trail. The confrontation with Holt's men was not the end of the conflict, but the end of the fear. I had drawn a line in the Arizona sand with a bullet and a name. Holt wouldn't stop, but now he knew the price of entry. The morning after the foreman rode away, I didn't start the day with chores. I started it by giving Tayuna her last, final choice. I had kept two things from my past: a small, tarnished silver band that had been my mother's, and a clean, fresh horse, a mare I'd stashed in a hidden canyon 3 miles from the way station. We packed only what we needed: the Winchester, the deed, flour, beans, coffee, and my old cavalry duster for Tayuna. We were leaving. Not running, but moving on a pilgrimage of 2. The way station, the symbol of our initial struggle and protection, was no longer needed. Our bond was now portable. I stood in the center of the yard, the sun rising over the jagged peaks. Tayuna was ready, wearing the blue calico shirt and my heavy duster, a pack slung over her good shoulder. "You have the deed," I said, my voice low. "This land is yours. You can stay, wait for the law, or sell it and walk away a rich woman." She walked to the post, took the deed, and without hesitation, walked to the stove, crumpling the paper. She threw it into the cold embers. "Law is Holt's," she said, her eyes meeting mine. "Freedom is with Silas." In that moment, she was truly Kestrel, the free, soaring spirit of the desert. I took the tarnished silver band from my pocket. It wasn't shiny. It wasn't valuable. It was just a promise. I looked at her, my hand trembling slightly. "I cannot promise easy life," I said. "Only honor and my shoulder." She held out her hand. Her fingers, strong and calloused from work, closed around the ring. She slid it onto her own finger. "My name is Tayuna Vance," she said, the words a silent vow. There was no preacher, no witnesses. We stood there, 2 scarred souls under the vast, unforgiving sky, joined by a history of loss and a future of pure, unadulterated choice. We rode out before the sun was high, not on the main trail, but through the treacherous, little-known pass that wound up into the Dragoon Mountains. We rode for hours, speaking only in gestures and necessary words, pointing out trails, checking the cinch. This was the work of 2 people bound by trust, already comfortable in the silence of their shared purpose. We stopped at a high ridge, a place overlooking the entire valley. Below us, Dust Devil Pass was a smudge of smoke and filth. The trail stretched out, a long, winding scar across the desert floor, leading to the unknown territories of New Mexico and beyond. Tayuna dismounted first. She stood at the edge, the wind whipping her black hair around her face, the heavy duster billowing out behind her like a pair of wings. She was no longer the victim of the auction, but the master of her horizon. I stood beside her. I looked at the endless, unforgiving landscape. It was a place that had taken everything from me, but had also given back the only thing I needed, a reason